Hey folks, and welcome to another episode of Podcraft. This is the show all about podcasting, from launching your show to monetization and everything in between. I'm Colin Gray from The Podcast Host, as always, and this is a bit of a different episode this time. We're doing what's called an episode drop with the most excellent Evo Terra. Now, episode drops are essentially an episode exchange. So we've got an episode of Podcraft dropping on Evo's feed over on Podcast Pontifications, which I'll tell you about in just a sec and how this all works. But it means that we're dropping an episode of his on Podcraft here as well. So the whole idea, which you could obviously use for your own podcast at some point, is to find someone in your area, in your niche, somebody podcasting on something similar to yourself, and really just exchange audiences. Now, some people say it's a bit of competition, you're passing your audience around. It might be somebody that's competing with your own area, but let's be honest, everyone listens to more than one podcast in your area. There's plenty of room, plenty of space, and especially in this case, Evo actually does a kind of a different approach to us. So to tell you about Evo I met at Podcast Movement a couple of years ago now, and got to know him, and really got to respect the way he thinks about the industry and the deep thinking he puts into how to make successful shows and how the podcasting industry works. So I listen to Podcast Pontifications on a pretty regular basis too, and he releases short episodes, so 5 to 10 minutes, on, I think it's 4 days a week. So he's releasing a really regular episode, really going deep on podcasting. So it's a good companion to Podcraft, obviously, that we go into the real how-to. And Evo does a lot more more current affairs, not current affairs, you know what I mean? Like the stuff that's going on now and the trends and how to take advantage of, little things that are happening right now, as well as longer term trends and longer term thoughts. So pop over to Podcast Pontifications. You'll find that on iTunes. Search iTunes? What am I talking about? Apple Podcasts. Search Podcast Pontifications on Apple Podcasts to find them there. And you'll find Podcast Pontifications. Go and have a listen. And if you want to try an episode drop, by all means, drop us a line and let us know how it goes. I'd love to hear how an episode drop goes with yourselves and your own niche, finding somebody related. But anyway, take it away, Evo. Let's hear what he has to say.
Nearly 20 years in, and many podcasters still have trouble thinking of podcasting as an industry. But our problem does not plague the cash-flush brands looking to enter our industry. Whose perspective will win out? Hello and welcome to another Podcast Pontifications with me, Evo Terra. How big is the podcasting industry? Go ahead. Answer that yourself. Now, if you have an answer, it's probably something like $1 billion. That's the number the IAB gives out for U.S. advertising sales in 2021. Now, you can make that a little more than $1.4 billion if you factor in the entire global advertising estimates, which is probably a good idea for us to do. But that's just revenue podcasting sees from advertising. That's not the entire podcasting industry. So it's rather missing out, if you will, on everything that you and I spend money on. Things like microphones and hosting providers and content creation and podcast conferences. Now, second question, who would you say are the big players in the podcasting industry? You probably said Apple, Spotify, maybe a Wondery out there. But you probably didn't bother to consider TuneIn, or certainly SoundCloud, did you? Yeah, me either. But that's because we're inside podcasting, with all the baggage and the history and, punditry that comes with that. But big brands and industries on the outside of podcasting looking in, they need a different perspective. So how shocked would you be if I told you that the total size of the podcasting industry is somewhere north of $14 billion? 14. Not one. Now, that's an estimate of the total size of our industry, and that estimate is projected to grow to nearly $95 billion in 2028. 6 years. That, my friends, is a healthy growth curve. And when big brands look at podcasting, they absolutely look at the companies we've collectively dismissed or decided to poo-poo, like TuneIn, like SoundCloud. It doesn't matter that we podcasters feel those companies aren't worthy of being in the podcasting space if we feel anything at all about those companies. Both of them, and probably lots of others we're ignoring, are clearly part of the industry of podcasting. Not just a part, actually a large portion of the machinery behind the total podcasting industry. Let's go back to our perspective for just a moment, the jaded podcaster, if you will. We're going to see more of these outside-looking-in reports as this decade progresses, really. And when we jaded podcasters read these reports from people outside of our industry, we're going to dismiss them just completely out of hand. I mean, how can we take seriously a report that says, for example, advertising is the only revenue-generating method for podcasting, but it has failed to gain traction as the audience refrain from listening to advertisements between ongoing content? Well, fine, but we know that's not true. Podcast advertising is growing greatly. Or what about blood pressure-raising statements like, the solo podcast format has advantages such as ease of use and minimal investment, with mainly just a microphone and basic editing tools. Once again, propagating the podcasting is cheap and easy myth. So yeah, reports like this, utter bullshit when looked at from the inside. But they're also quite beneficial for us, even as we hate read them. And in fact, that is exactly what I recommend you do. Hate read the report that I have linked in the episode details of this show. And then, once your anger has subsided, or your mirth has subsided, read it again. This is what our industry looks like to the outside world. It's a very appealing look, which is bound to bring in more interest, more money, more content, and more listeners. But I can hear you saying it right now. What about the indie podcasters, Evo? Well, here's what I think about that. You see, I'm not worried about the indie podcaster in all of this. Now, that's not to say I don't care about the indie podcaster. I do. Deeply. Hell, I am an indie podcaster. I've always been an indie podcaster. I just don't buy much the whole corporate podcasters are ruining podcasting and excluding indie podcasters argument. I mean, yeah, I do agree that corporate-backed podcaster networks can often outcompete a lot of indie podcasters. But you know what? Just like corporate-backed movies, TV shows, books, movies, documentaries, news outlets, education centers, restaurant, pet supply stores, and every other corporate-backed entity often outcompetes their under-moneyed indie counterparts. But also, there are plenty of indies in every one of those categories I just mentioned doing well. Now, do they struggle? Sure. Are they afforded the same access as corporate-backed properties? No, not always. But do they make it? Yeah, some do. And some really thrive. And so will indie podcasters. And with that, I shall be back tomorrow with yet another podcast Pontifications. Cheers!
Podcast Pontifications is written and narrated by Evo Terra. He's on a mission to make podcasting better. Links to everything mentioned in today's episode are in the notes section of your podcast listening app. A written-to-be-read article based on today's episode is available at podcastpontifications.com, where you'll also find a video version and a corrected transcript, both created by Alley Press. Podcast Pontifications is a production of Simpler Media. Find out more at simpler.media.